In the unforgiving world of military training, where split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death, one moment of prejudice would shatter everything a decorated Marine thought he knew about strength, respect, and what it truly means to serve. What happened next in that dusty training compound would not only change two lives forever, but challenge every assumption about who belongs on the front lines of America's most elite fighting forces. This is the true story of Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, a collision course between old-school military tradition and the unstoppable force of progress that would leave both warriors questioning everything they believed about honor, duty, and the meaning of brotherhood in arms. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had seen it all in his 12 years of service. From the scorching deserts of Afghanistan to the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, he had earned his stripes the hard way, carrying wounded comrades through enemy fire and leading missions that others deemed impossible. At 34, Marcus was the kind of Marine that younger soldiers looked up to, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with scars that told stories of valor and sacrifice. His chest bore ribbons that spoke of Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, and commendations that most servicemen only dreamed of earning. But Marcus carried something else with him, something far less honorable than his decorated service record. Deep in his core, planted by a childhood spent listening to his grandfather's war stories and reinforced by years in predominantly male units, was an unshakable belief that combat was a man's domain. Women, in his mind, were meant to be protected, not to be protectors. They belonged at home, raising families, not in foxholes where split-second decisions meant life or death for entire squads. This wasn't just casual bias. It was a fundamental part of his identity. Marcus had grown up in a small Texas town where traditional gender roles weren't just expected. They were sacred. His grandfather, a World War II veteran who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, had filled young Marcus's head with stories of brotherhood, honor, and the unbreakable bonds between men who had faced death together. Never once in those stories did women appear as anything other than the sweethearts and wives waiting faithfully at home. The Marine Corps had initially seemed to validate these beliefs. For the first decade of his service, Marcus had served in units where women were either absent entirely or relegated to support roles far from the front lines. He had developed friendships, earned respect, and built a reputation based on his willingness to put his life on the line for his brothers in arms. The few times he had encountered women in military settings, they had been in medical, intelligence, or administrative positions, roles that, in his mind, confirmed his beliefs about where women belonged in the military hierarchy. But the world was changing around Marcus, whether he liked it or not. In 2013, the Department of Defense had lifted the ban on women serving in combat roles, and by 2016, all combat positions, including those in Special Operations Forces, had been open to women who could meet the standards. These changes had been gradual in implementation, and Marcus had been fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, depending on one's perspective, to avoid serving alongside women in combat roles during most of his career. That was about to change dramatically. The joint training exercise at Camp Pendleton was designed to be the most realistic and challenging cross-service cooperation drill ever attempted. The scenario involved a hostage rescue mission in a hostile urban environment, with multiple agencies and service branches working together to achieve a common objective. Navy SEALs would provide the primary assault force, Marines would handle perimeter security and backup, Army Rangers would coordinate air support, and Air Force personnel would manage communications and extraction. Marcus had been selected for the exercise based on his exemplary service record and his experience in urban combat situations. He was proud to represent the Marines in such a high-profile training operation, and he looked forward to working alongside some of the military's most elite operators. What he didn't know was that this exercise would mark the first time he would serve alongside women in direct combat roles. The briefing room was packed with some of the most elite soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen in the American military. Marcus took his seat among his fellow Marines, automatically cataloging the other participants. He recognized several faces from previous joint operations, hardened veterans with thousand-yard stares, and the quiet confidence that came from surviving multiple deployments in hostile territories. As the briefing began, Marcus found himself studying the SEAL team that would be leading the primary assault. They were impressive specimens, each one clearly in peak physical condition and radiating the quiet intensity that marked America's most elite warriors. He counted 6 operators total, noting their equipment, their bearing, and their obvious readiness for whatever challenges lay ahead. It wasn't until the team leader began individual introductions that Marcus noticed something that stopped him cold. The smallest member of the SEAL team, whom he had initially assumed was just a young male operator, spoke with a distinctly female voice. Marcus blinked hard, certain he had misheard or misunderstood something. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a compact build that spoke of functional strength rather than bulk. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dark eyes held the same steely focus that Marcus had seen in countless elite operators over the years. When she spoke, her voice was calm, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under pressure. Marcus felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. Women didn't serve as Navy SEALs. They couldn't pass the training. They didn't have the physical strength, the mental toughness, or the killer instinct necessary for special operations. Everything he believed about military service, about combat, about the natural order of things, seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. As Sarah continued her portion of the briefing, outlining her team's approach to the hostage rescue scenario, Marcus found himself searching for signs of weakness, incompetence, or inadequacy. Surely this was some kind of experiment, some political correctness gone wrong that would reveal itself once the real action started. No woman could possibly measure up to the standards that had been drilled into him as the gold standard of military excellence. But as the briefing continued, Marcus was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Sarah's tactical knowledge was encyclopedic. Her understanding of urban combat scenarios was sophisticated and nuanced. Her questions to the other team leaders were incisive and revealed a depth of operational experience that couldn't be faked. Most disturbing of all, the other SEAL team members, men whose respect Marcus would have given anything to earn, clearly deferred to her expertise and leadership without question. During the break, Marcus found himself in conversation with Gunnery Sergeant Jake Peterson, a fellow Marine who had served alongside Marcus in Afghanistan. Jake was notorious for his blunt assessments and his inability to suffer fools gladly, which made his next comment all the more jarring. "That SEAL commander knows her stuff," Jake said, nodding towards Sarah, who was engaged in an intense tactical discussion with the Army Ranger team leader. "I heard she's been through some serious operations. Multiple deployments, Silver Star, the whole 9 yards. Marcus stared at his longtime friend in disbelief. "You're telling me you're okay with this? With her being in charge of the primary assault?" Jake shrugged. "Standards are standards, Marcus. If she passed the training and earned her place, who am I to question it? Besides, look at her team. Those guys wouldn't follow someone they didn't respect, no matter what the brass ordered." The comment hit Marcus like a physical blow. Jake Peterson was old-school military, a traditionalist who had never been accused of being politically correct or progressive. If even Jake was willing to accept this fundamental change in the military landscape, what did that say about Marcus's own position? As the exercise preparation continued over the following days, Marcus found himself watching Sarah with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He was looking for any sign of weakness, any indication that she was getting special treatment or being held to different standards than her male counterparts. Instead, he witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about military excellence. Sarah was always the first to arrive at training sessions and the last to leave. During physical training, she kept pace with operators who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. Her weapons handling was flawless. Her tactical thinking was creative and effective, and her leadership style commanded respect without demanding it. More troubling for Marcus was the way Sarah interacted with her team and other personnel. She was professional but approachable, confident but not arrogant, and she seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. Marcus had prided himself on his ability to assess and lead others, but watching Sarah in action made him question whether he had ever truly understood what leadership meant. The final straw came during a planning session 3 days before the exercise was scheduled to begin. The scenario involved a complex multi-story building with multiple hostages, heavily armed opposition, and civilian bystanders who needed to be protected. Different teams had proposed various approaches, each with their own advantages and drawbacks. Sarah listened carefully to each proposal, asked thoughtful questions, and then presented her own approach. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. She had identified vulnerabilities in the building's structure that others had missed, proposed timing sequences that maximize surprise while minimizing risk, and developed contingency plans for scenarios that Marcus hadn't even considered. As the room fell silent, absorbing the implications of her proposal, Marcus felt a rage building inside him that he didn't fully understand. This woman, this small, quiet woman who challenged every assumption he had ever made about strength, courage, and military excellence, was making him look like an amateur in front of his peers. When the session ended, Marcus approached Sarah directly. He told himself he was going to ask professional questions about her tactical approach, perhaps offer some insights based on his own extensive combat experience. Instead, he found himself face to face with someone whose calm confidence made him feel foolish and insecure. "Interesting approach, Lieutenant Commander," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Very creative." Sarah looked up at him with those steady dark eyes, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his forced professionalism to the resentment and prejudice beneath. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she replied simply. "I appreciate the feedback." There was nothing confrontational in her response, nothing that Marcus could point to as disrespectful or inappropriate. Yet somehow, her quiet confidence felt like a challenge to everything he believed about himself and his place in the military hierarchy. As Marcus walked away from that encounter, he realized that the upcoming exercise would be about more than just tactical proficiency and inter-service cooperation. For him, it would be a test of everything he believed about strength, honor, and what it meant to be a warrior. He was determined to prove, once and for all, that there were some places where women simply didn't belong. He had no idea that he was about to learn the most humbling lesson of his entire military career. The morning of the exercise dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect weather that made Southern California famous. But the atmosphere in the staging area was thick with tension that had nothing to do with meteorology. Marcus had spent the previous night tossing and turning, his mind churning with scenarios and possibilities, all centered around his growing fixation with proving that Sarah Chun had no business leading elite military operations. As the teams conducted their final equipment checks and reviewed their assignments one last time, Marcus found himself paying attention to details he normally would have overlooked. He watched how Sarah's gear was distributed across her compact frame, noting that she carried the same load as her male teammates despite being significantly smaller. He observed her interactions with the other SEAL team members, searching for any signs of special consideration or protective behavior that would confirm his suspicions about women receiving different treatment in combat roles. Instead, what he witnessed only deepened his confusion and resentment. Sarah's teammates treated her exactly as they would any other team leader, with professional respect, tactical deference, and the kind of casual camaraderie that developed between elite operators who trusted each other completely. There were no awkward moments, no obvious accommodations, and no signs that anyone else shared Marcus's concerns about having a woman in command of the primary assault force. The exercise scenario was designed to unfold over 12 hours, beginning with intelligence gathering and surveillance phases, progressing through infiltration and positioning, and culminating in the actual hostage rescue operation. Multiple observer controllers would monitor every phase, evaluating tactical decisions, communication effectiveness, and overall mission success. For the participants, it represented an opportunity to demonstrate their skills on a joint service stage. For Marcus, it had become something much more personal. During the initial surveillance phase, the various teams took positions around the mock urban environment that had been constructed specifically for this exercise. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Multi-story buildings with realistic interiors, civilian role players going about their daily business, and opposition forces equipped with advanced simulation technology that would make firefights feel authentic without the lethal consequences. Marcus's Marine unit was responsible for establishing outer perimeter security and providing backup support for the SEAL assault team. It was a critical role that required constant vigilance and coordination with the primary assault force. But Marcus found himself paying more attention to Sarah's radio communications than to his own tactical responsibilities. Sarah's voice over the tactical radio network was calm, professional, and precise. She coordinated with various team elements, adjusted positions based on changing intelligence, and made real-time tactical decisions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of urban combat dynamics. Each communication was economical and clear, containing exactly the information needed without unnecessary elaboration. As the morning progressed and the teams moved into their assault positions, Marcus noticed something that made his jaw clench with frustration. The other participants, Marines, Rangers, and Air Force personnel, were responding to Sarah's commands without hesitation or question. Seasoned combat veterans who had earned their respect through blood and sacrifice were taking orders from this woman as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The moment that would change everything began innocuously enough. Sarah's team had successfully infiltrated the target building and was moving through the lower floors, systematically clearing rooms and advancing toward the hostage's suspected location. Marcus's unit was maintaining overwatch on the building's exterior, ready to intercept any opposition forces attempting to escape or reinforcements trying to enter. Through his scope, Marcus had an excellent view of the building's second-floor windows. He could see the tactical lights of Sarah's team as they moved through the darkened interior, their movements precise and coordinated despite the challenging environment. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and the exercise seemed destined to be completed successfully. Then, the scenario controllers introduced an unexpected complication. A group of role-playing opposition forces, larger and better armed than the intelligence briefings had indicated, began moving toward the building from an unexpected direction. The scenario was designed to test the team's ability to adapt to changing circumstances, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Sarah's team was in the middle of the most delicate phase of the operation, requiring absolute focus and coordination to extract the hostages safely. Marcus received the radio call from the exercise controllers almost simultaneously with everyone else on the tactical network. A substantial opposition force was approaching from the northeast, and they would reach the target building within minutes. The original plan called for Marcus's team to intercept such threats, but their current position was optimized for a different avenue of approach. In a real combat situation, Marcus would have immediately requested permission to reposition his team to meet the new threat. But something darker was driving his decision-making process. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of decisive action that he believed only men were truly capable of. Here was a chance to show that when things got complicated and dangerous, traditional military leadership was what actually mattered. Instead of coordinating with Sarah or requesting permission to adjust the plan, Marcus made a unilateral decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He directed his team to move aggressively toward the approaching opposition force, abandoning their assigned overwatch positions without authorization and leaving Sarah's team without the backup support they were counting on. Marcus told himself he was taking decisive action to protect the mission. In reality, he was setting up a scenario where Sarah would be forced to deal with complications without adequate support. Complications that he hoped would expose the weaknesses he was convinced existed beneath her professional facade. The plan backfired spectacularly. Sarah's team, monitoring the tactical situation through their own surveillance assets, immediately recognized what Marcus was doing. Rather than panic or call for assistance, Sarah made a series of rapid tactical adjustments that demonstrated exactly why she had earned her position as team leader. First, she repositioned two of her team members to cover the approaches that Marcus's unit had abandoned. Then, she adjusted the hostage extraction timeline to account for the changed tactical situation. Finally, she coordinated with the Air Force communications team to request updated intelligence on the opposition force's movements and capabilities. All of this happened within the space of 3 minutes, during which Sarah never once criticized Marcus's unauthorized position change or demanded explanations for his actions. She simply adapted to the new reality and continued executing her mission with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the exercise. Meanwhile, Marcus was discovering that his impulsive decision had placed his own team in a tactically disadvantageous position. The opposition force he had moved to intercept was larger and better positioned than his hasty reconnaissance had indicated. Instead of achieving the dramatic success he had envisioned, Marcus found his team pinned down by superior numbers and firepower, unable to effectively engage the enemy or provide meaningful support to the overall mission. As simulated gunfire erupted around his position and his team members called for guidance on how to extract themselves from the deteriorating situation, Marcus realized he had made a serious tactical error. His desire to prove a point about women in combat had led him to abandon sound military judgment and place both his own team and the overall mission at risk. The situation grew worse when the opposition force, having successfully engaged Marcus's out-of-position Marines, began moving additional elements toward the target building. The scenario controllers, impressed by the opposition's tactical success, began feeding them additional intelligence and resources that made the hostage rescue significantly more challenging. It was at this point that Sarah's true capabilities became impossible for Marcus to ignore or dismiss. Rather than becoming flustered by the deteriorating tactical situation, Sarah seemed to thrive on the complexity and chaos. She coordinated a series of movements that drew the opposition away from Marcus's pinned-down team while simultaneously advancing her own mission objectives. Her communications became even more precise and economical, and her decision-making accelerated to match the pace of unfolding events. Using a combination of misdirection, superior positioning, and creative use of available resources, Sarah managed to extract the hostages, neutralize the primary opposition force in the building, and create an opportunity for Marcus's team to disengage from their disadvantageous position. She accomplished all of this while maintaining constant coordination with other team elements and adapting to real-time changes in the tactical environment. As Marcus finally led his team back to a defensive position where they could provide meaningful support, he found himself listening to radio communications that chronicled a textbook example of small unit leadership under pressure. Sarah had not only salvaged a deteriorating situation, but had turned it into a comprehensive tactical success that exceeded the original mission parameters. The most humbling aspect of the experience was Sarah's complete lack of criticism or blame toward Marcus for his unauthorized actions. She treated his tactical error as simply another variable to be managed, another complication to be overcome through superior planning and execution. There was no anger in her voice, no frustration or condescension, just the calm professionalism of someone who was completely focused on mission success. As the hostage extraction phase concluded successfully and the teams began moving toward their extraction points, Marcus found himself grappling with emotions he didn't fully understand. His attempt to expose Sarah's supposed weaknesses had instead highlighted his own tactical limitations and poor judgment. His desire to prove that women didn't belong in combat had resulted in a demonstration of exactly why Sarah had earned her position through merit rather than political correctness. But perhaps most troubling of all was the growing realization that his prejudices had led him to place both his own Marines and the overall mission at unnecessary risk. In his determination to prove a point about gender and combat effectiveness, Marcus had violated fundamental principles of military leadership and teamwork that had been drilled into him since his earliest days as a recruit. As the teams regrouped for the final phase of the exercise, Marcus caught sight of Sarah coordinating with the other team leaders for the extraction phase. She looked exactly the same as she had at the beginning of the day, calm, focused, and completely professional. There were no signs of strain or stress from managing the complex tactical situation that Marcus's actions had created. For the first time since learning about Sarah's participation in the exercise, Marcus began to question whether his assumptions about women in combat were based on reality or on prejudices that he had never seriously examined. The evidence of his own eyes was becoming impossible to ignore, and the comfortable certainties that had guided his military career for over a decade were beginning to crumble. But Marcus Rodriguez was not ready to abandon a lifetime of beliefs without a fight. As the exercise moved into its final phase, his resentment and frustration continued to build toward a confrontation that would change both of their lives forever. The extraction phase of the exercise should have been routine. All objectives had been met, the hostages were secure, and the various team elements were moving toward predetermined extraction points where helicopters would simulate the final phase of the operation. For most of the participants, it represented the successful conclusion of a challenging but educational training exercise. For Marcus Rodriguez, it marked the beginning of the darkest moment of his military career. As the teams converged on the primary extraction zone, a large open area surrounded by abandoned buildings that provided excellent cover and concealment, Marcus found himself walking roughly 20 meters behind Sarah's SEAL team. He had spent the final phase of the exercise watching her coordinate the complex logistics of moving multiple teams, civilians, and simulated casualties to safety, and each demonstration of her competence had fed the growing rage that was building inside him. The rational part of Marcus's mind recognized that Sarah had performed flawlessly throughout the exercise. She had adapted to unexpected complications, made sound tactical decisions under pressure, and demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that the military valued in its most elite units. But rationality was losing ground to emotions that Marcus didn't fully understand and couldn't seem to control. Every time Sarah issued a clear, professional command over the radio, Marcus heard what sounded like a challenge to his fundamental beliefs about strength and leadership. Every time another service member responded to her directions without question, he felt his own position in the military hierarchy being diminished. Most troubling of all, every time he caught himself acknowledging her tactical competence, he felt like he was betraying principles that had defined his identity for his entire adult life. As the teams approached the extraction zone, Sarah was engaged in a final coordination call with the helicopter crews that would complete the simulated extraction. She was walking slightly apart from her team, focused on her radio communications, and apparently unaware that Marcus was close enough to overhear her conversation. What Marcus heard in that conversation was the final straw that broke his remaining self-control. Sarah was coordinating landing zones, passenger manifests, and timing sequences with the same calm professionalism that had marked her performance throughout the exercise. But more than that, she was also providing tactical recommendations to the helicopter crews about approach routes, potential threat areas, and contingency procedures in case the extraction became complicated. The helicopter pilots, seasoned aviators with thousands of hours of combat flying time, were not only listening to her recommendations, but actively requesting her input on technical aspects of the extraction. They treated her as a subject matter expert whose knowledge could help them perform their jobs more effectively and safely. For Marcus, this represented the complete inversion of everything he believed about military competence and authority. Here was this woman, half his size, and lacking his years of combat experience, being treated as an authority figure by pilots whose courage and skill he had always admired unreservedly. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable, and the careful control he had maintained throughout the exercise finally shattered. Marcus quickened his pace until he was walking directly behind Sarah, close enough to hear every word of her radio conversation. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw was tight with suppressed anger, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. The other Marines in his unit, noticing their leader's obvious agitation, began to spread out slightly, unconsciously creating space for whatever was about to happen. As Sarah concluded her radio call and began moving toward the extraction zone, Marcus saw his opportunity. The area they were traversing was relatively isolated, with her SEAL teammates far enough ahead that they might not immediately notice an altercation. The observer controllers were focused on other aspects of the exercise, and the simulated chaos of the extraction would provide cover for a confrontation that Marcus had been building toward all day. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Sarah had paused to check her GPS coordinates one final time, ensuring that her team was moving toward the correct landing zone, when Marcus stepped up directly behind her. She was still focused on her equipment when he spoke, his voice thick with contempt and barely controlled rage. "Hey!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Sarah turned around, her expression neutral and professional, apparently expecting some routine coordination question or tactical update. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man whose eyes held a fury that seemed completely disproportionate to their situation. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Sarah replied, her voice calm and questioning. "Is there something you need?" The reasonable tone in her voice, the complete lack of defensiveness or awareness of his emotional state, struck Marcus like a physical blow. Here he was seething with rage and resentment, and she was responding as if he were any other service member with a legitimate question. Her apparent inability to recognize the challenge he represented felt like the ultimate dismissal of everything he believed about himself. "You think you're pretty hot stuff, don't you?" Marcus snarled, stepping closer to Sarah until he was well inside her personal space. "Think you've got it all figured out, playing soldier with the big boys." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, her eyes becoming more alert as she recognized that this was not a professional interaction. But her voice remained steady and controlled as she responded. "Staff Sergeant, I'm not sure what you're referring to," she said calmly. "If there's a problem with the exercise coordination, I'm happy to discuss it through proper channels." The professionalism in her response, the refusal to be baited into an emotional reaction, only intensified Marcus's rage. He had expected defensiveness, anger, or fear, emotional responses that would confirm his beliefs about women's inability to handle high-stress situations. Instead, he was getting exactly the kind of calm, measured response that he would expect from any elite operator. "Professionals." Marcus laughed harshly. "Let me tell you about proper channels, sweetheart. Proper channels would be you admitting that you don't belong here, that this whole thing is just some politically correct experiment that's going to get real soldiers killed." The use of the term sweetheart was deliberate and calculated, designed to reduce Sarah from a fellow professional to something less threatening and more familiar. Marcus was unconsciously trying to restore a power dynamic that would make sense to him, to put this woman back in a category where he understood how to interact with her. Sarah's eyes hardened slightly, but her voice remained level. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I think we should end this conversation now. If you have concerns about the exercise or my performance, I suggest you discuss them with the appropriate authorities." She turned to walk away, clearly hoping to de-escalate a situation that was rapidly spinning out of control. For Marcus, this represented the ultimate dismissal. Not only was she refusing to engage with the challenges to her competence, but she was treating him like a problem to be managed rather than a fellow warrior whose opinions mattered. Marcus reached out and grabbed Sarah's shoulder, spinning her around to face him again. The physical contact crossed a line that transformed their confrontation from verbal harassment into something far more serious. "Don't you walk away from me," Marcus shouted, his face flushed with rage and his voice carrying across the extraction zone. "You think you can just dismiss me? You think your little performance today means anything?" Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She smoothly stepped back, breaking Marcus's grip on her shoulder while maintaining her balance and creating distance for whatever might come next. Her hands moved to a ready position, and her stance shifted subtly to provide better stability and mobility. "Staff Sergeant, you need to step back and calm down," Sarah said, her voice still controlled, but now carrying an edge of authority that Marcus had heard her use during the tactical phases of the exercise. "This conversation is over." But Marcus was far beyond reason at this point. All the frustration, resentment, and wounded pride that had been building throughout the exercise came pouring out in a torrent of verbal abuse that revealed the true depths of his prejudice. "Calm down," he screamed. "You want me to calm down? I've been watching you all day, pretending to be some kind of super soldier, and everyone just plays along like this is normal. Like having some little girl in charge of real military operations makes any sense at all." Sarah stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face, her body language alert but not aggressive. She was clearly prepared for whatever might happen next, but she was still trying to de-escalate the situation through professional behavior. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said firmly, "you are out of line. I'm ordering you to stand down and return to your unit immediately." The word ordering was like a match thrown onto gasoline. The idea that this woman, this small, quiet woman who challenged everything he believed about military hierarchy, would dare to give him orders pushed Marcus completely over the edge. "Ordering me?" Marcus's voice rose to a shout that carried across the entire extraction zone. "You don't get to order me to do anything. You're nothing but a diversity hire playing dress-up in a real soldier's uniform." It was at this moment that Sarah's teammates, alerted by Marcus's shouting, began moving back toward their position. Other exercise participants were also taking notice of the confrontation, and observer controllers were beginning to converge on their location. Marcus saw the approaching figures in his peripheral vision and realized that his opportunity to make his point was rapidly disappearing. In his rage-clouded thinking, he decided that words weren't sufficient to express his contempt for everything Sarah represented. The physical attack happened so quickly that most witnesses later struggled to describe exactly what they had seen. Marcus drew back his right hand and swung it towards Sarah's face with all the force he could muster, intending to deliver a blow that would finally put this woman in what he considered her proper place. As his fist moved through the air, he screamed the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "The beach." But Marcus Rodriguez had made a critical error in judgment. He had spent so much time focusing on Sarah's gender that he had completely failed to appreciate what her position as a SEAL team leader actually meant in terms of training, experience, and combat capability. Sarah Chun hadn't earned her position through political correctness or social engineering. She had survived one of the most grueling selection processes in the American military, had completed the same training that had broken countless elite male operators, and had proven herself in actual combat situations where failure meant death for herself and her teammates. What happened next demonstrated exactly why she had earned the respect of some of America's most elite warriors. As Marcus's fist approached her face, Sarah moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural to the witnesses. She sidestepped the punch while simultaneously grabbing Marcus's wrist, used his own momentum against him, and executed a textbook combat takedown that sent the larger man crashing to the ground with stunning force. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Marcus found himself flat on his back, staring up at the sky, with Sarah Chun kneeling beside him and controlling his right arm in a joint lock that could easily dislocate his shoulder if she chose to apply pressure. Her knee was positioned across his throat in a way that made breathing difficult but not impossible, and her free hand was ready to strike if he continued to resist. The most shocking aspect of the entire encounter was Sarah's expression. There was no anger, no triumph, no emotional reaction at all. She looked down at Marcus with the same calm professionalism that had marked her performance throughout the exercise, as if disabling a violent attacker was just another routine task to be completed efficiently. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said quietly, her voice steady and controlled despite having just defended herself against a physical assault. "You are going to remain on the ground until the MPs arrive. If you attempt to move or continue this altercation, I will consider you a continued threat and respond accordingly." Marcus, stunned by the speed and effectiveness of Sarah's response, found himself staring up into the face of someone he was finally beginning to understand he had seriously underestimated. The woman he had dismissed as weak and incompetent had just demonstrated combat skills that exceeded his own, and she had done it with an efficiency and professionalism that highlighted exactly how far his own behavior had fallen below military standards. As the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that help was arriving, Marcus realized that his confrontation with Sarah Chun had just become the defining moment of his military career, and not in the way he had intended. The moments immediately following Marcus's assault and Sarah's defensive response seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone present. The extract zone, which seconds earlier had been filled with the controlled chaos of a successful training exercise, suddenly became eerily quiet as personnel from multiple service branches converged on the scene of the confrontation. Sarah maintained her position controlling Marcus for exactly 93 seconds, long enough for the military police to arrive and assess the situation, but not a moment longer than necessary. Her release of the joint lock was as precise and controlled as everything else she had done, and she stepped back immediately to give the MPs room to work while remaining close enough to provide assistance if Marcus chose to continue his aggressive behavior. Marcus, for his part, remained motionless on the ground for several long moments after Sarah released him, staring up at the sky while his mind struggled to process what had just occurred. The physical pain from hitting the ground and the embarrassment of being so thoroughly outmatched were nothing compared to the psychological impact of having his fundamental worldview shattered in the space of 3 seconds. Master Sergeant David Kim, the senior MP who had responded to the disturbance call, was a 20-year veteran who had seen every variety of military misconduct imaginable. But even his experienced eyes widened as he took in the scene and began interviewing witnesses about what had transpired. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Master Sergeant Kim said to the first witness, a Marine corporal from Marcus's own unit who had watched the entire confrontation unfold. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez physically attacked Lieutenant Commander Chun, and she defended herself." "Yes, Master Sergeant," the corporal replied, his voice tight with embarrassment and disbelief. He threw a punch at her face while shouting inappropriate language. She took him down in about 2 seconds. "I've never seen anything like it." As Kim continued gathering statements from witnesses, a clearer picture began emerging of not just the physical altercation, but the verbal harassment that had preceded it. Multiple personnel reported hearing Marcus's derogatory comments about women in the military, his unprofessional language, and his escalating aggression toward a superior officer. Sarah, meanwhile, was providing her own statement with the same calm professionalism that had marked her behavior throughout the incident. She recounted Marcus's behavior objectively, without editorial comment or emotional embellishment, focusing on facts and actions rather than interpretations or motivations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached me and began making inappropriate comments about my gender and my fitness for military service, Sarah reported. I attempted to de-escalate the situation by ending the conversation and walking away. He then physically restrained me by grabbing my shoulder, continued his verbal harassment, and finally attempted to strike me in the face while shouting a threat. I defended myself using minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat. Master Sergeant Kim found himself in the unusual position of having a clear-cut case of assault against a superior officer, with multiple witnesses and a victim who had responded with textbook precision to defend herself. In his 2 decades of military police work, he had rarely encountered a situation where the facts were so unambiguous and the appropriate response so obvious. As Marcus was helped to his feet and formally placed under arrest, the full scope of what he had done began to sink in. He had physically assaulted a superior officer during a joint service training exercise, in full view of personnel from multiple branches of the military. He had used derogatory language based on gender, had failed to follow direct orders to stand down, and had created an incident that would require investigation at the highest levels of military command. But perhaps most damaging of all was the realization that his actions had been witnessed by the very people whose respect he had spent his entire career trying to earn. The elite operators, seasoned combat veterans, and distinguished service members who had been participating in the exercise had all watched him lose control, behave unprofessionally, and ultimately be defeated by the woman he had been trying to humiliate. The immediate consequences were swift and severe. Marcus was escorted from the exercise area under arrest. His participation in the training terminated effective immediately. His commanding officer was notified, formal charges would be filed, and an investigation would begin that would examine not just the incident itself, but Marcus's entire service record for patterns of behavior that might have predicted such an outcome. For Sarah, the immediate aftermath was more complex. While she was clearly the victim of an unprovoked assault and had acted appropriately in defending herself, the incident had disrupted a major training exercise and created complications that would require careful management. Colonel Patricia Morrison, the senior officer overseeing the joint exercise, arrived at the scene within minutes of the MPs. A career infantry officer who had broken multiple barriers during her own rise through the ranks. Colonel Morrison was uniquely qualified to understand both the significance of what had occurred and the delicate handling it would require. "Lieutenant Commander Chun," Colonel Morrison said as she approached Sarah, "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, ma'am," Sarah replied. "I'm fine." The incident was brief, and I was able to control the situation without sustaining any injuries. Colonel Morrison nodded, but her experienced eyes were already cataloging the broader implications of what had occurred. This incident would generate reports, investigations, and media attention that could impact not just the individuals involved, but the entire military's ongoing efforts to integrate women into combat roles. "I need you to understand," Colonel Morrison continued, "that this incident is going to receive significant attention at levels far above this exercise. Your response was textbook perfect, but there will be people who want to use this as evidence that women in combat roles create problems and complications." Sarah's response revealed the depth of her understanding about her position as one of the first women in naval special warfare. "I understand, ma'am. I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation and to address whatever concerns arise from this incident." As the exercise was officially suspended and personnel began the complex process of documenting everything that had occurred, word of the confrontation spread rapidly through the military community. The story of a female SEAL team leader being physically attacked by a Marine staff sergeant, and then defending herself with superior combat skills, became the subject of intense discussion and debate. The reactions were as varied as the backgrounds of the people discussing them. Some viewed the incident as confirmation that women in combat roles would inevitably lead to problems and complications. Others saw it as proof that women could not only handle themselves in difficult situations, but could excel in ways that challenged traditional assumptions about gender and military effectiveness. For Marcus's fellow Marines, the incident was particularly painful and embarrassing. The Marine Corps prided itself on discipline, honor, and professional behavior, and Marcus's actions reflected poorly on the entire service. His unit members found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to distance themselves from behavior that violated everything they had been taught about military values. "I've served with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez for 3 years," said Gunnery Sergeant Jake Peterson in his formal statement to investigators. "I've never seen him behave this way before. His conduct during this exercise was completely contrary to Marine Corps values and professional standards. It does not represent the attitudes or behavior of our unit or our service." The investigation that followed would be thorough, comprehensive, and ultimately damaging to Marcus's military career. Interviews with colleagues revealed a pattern of subtle bias and inappropriate comments about women in the military that had previously been overlooked or dismissed as harmless banter. His unauthorized tactical decision during the exercise was examined as evidence of poor judgment and failure to follow proper command protocols. Most damaging of all were the testimonies from witnesses who had observed Marcus's behavior throughout the exercise. Multiple service members reported his obvious resentment towards Sarah's leadership role, his inappropriate comments about women in combat, and his increasingly agitated behavior as the day progressed. The formal charges against Marcus would ultimately include assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, failure to obey direct orders, and creating a hostile environment based on gender discrimination. Each charge carried significant potential penalties, including possible reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from the service. But for Marcus himself, the legal consequences were secondary to the personal reckoning he was forced to confront. Sitting in a holding cell at Camp Pendleton, he was finally compelled to examine the beliefs and attitudes that had led him to this moment. The woman he had dismissed as weak and incompetent had demonstrated combat skills that exceeded his own. The diversity hire he had ridiculed had earned the genuine respect of elite operators whose approval he had always craved. The political correctness experiment he had railed against had proven herself more professional and competent than his own behavior had been. Every assumption Marcus had made about Sarah Chun had been proven wrong, and every prejudice he had harbored about women in the military had been contradicted by the evidence of his own eyes. The comfortable certainties that had guided his worldview for over 3 decades had been shattered by 3 seconds of combat that had revealed truths he had refused to acknowledge. As Marcus began the long process of facing formal charges and rebuilding his understanding of himself and his values, Sarah Chun returned to her duties with characteristic professionalism. She participated in the debriefing sessions, provided testimony for the investigation, and continued her service with the same quiet competence that had earned her position in naval special warfare. But the incident had created ripple effects that would extend far beyond the immediate participants. The story of a female SEAL successfully defending herself against a male attacker became a powerful symbol in ongoing debates about women in combat roles. It provided concrete evidence that women could not only handle themselves in dangerous situations, but could excel in ways that challenged traditional assumptions about physical capability and combat effectiveness. For the military as a whole, the incident served as a case study in both the challenges and the potential benefits of gender integration in combat roles. It highlighted the importance of addressing bias and prejudice before they escalated to dangerous levels, while also demonstrating that women who met the standards for elite units could perform at the same level as their male counterparts. As the formal investigation continued and the legal process moved forward, one thing became clear to everyone involved. This incident would be remembered and studied for years to come as a defining moment in the military's ongoing evolution toward full gender integration in combat roles. 6 months after the incident at Camp Pendleton, Marcus Rodriguez sat in a small conference room at the Marine Corps base Quantico, facing a panel of senior officers who had determined the final resolution of his case. The investigation had been thorough, the evidence was overwhelming, and the legal proceedings had moved forward with a methodical precision that marked all military justice processes. The Marcus Rodriguez who sat before the panel was a fundamentally different person from the one who had attacked Sarah Chun during that joint training exercise. The months of investigation, legal proceedings, and forced self-examination had stripped away the comfortable certainties that had guided his worldview for over 3 decades, leaving behind a man who was struggling to rebuild his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The formal charges against Marcus had been severe: assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, failure to obey direct orders, and creating a hostile environment based on gender discrimination. Each charge was supported by multiple witness testimonies, documentary evidence, and Marcus's own admissions during the investigation. The maximum possible penalties included dismissal from the service, reduction to the lowest enlisted rank, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement. However, as the investigation had proceeded, a more complex picture had emerged of both Marcus's behavior and the systemic issues that had contributed to the incident. Military psychologists who had evaluated Marcus found no evidence of mental illness or personality disorders that would explain his actions. Instead, they documented a case study in how deeply ingrained cultural biases could lead even exemplary service members to behave in ways that contradicted their own stated values. Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Walsh, the military psychologist who had spent dozens of hours evaluating Marcus, described her findings to the panel in clinical terms that somehow made the incident even more troubling. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez presents as an individual whose personal identity became so closely tied to traditional gender roles in military service that he experienced the success of women in combat roles as a fundamental threat to his self-concept, Dr. Walsh testified. His actions during the exercise represent not just individual prejudice, but the culmination of systemic attitudes that have not been adequately addressed as the military has evolved toward full gender integration. The psychological evaluation had forced Marcus to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his motivations. Through months of counseling and self-examination, he had been compelled to trace the origins of his beliefs about women in combat back to their sources in his childhood, his military training, and his experiences in a predominantly male military culture. The process had been painful and humbling. Marcus had been forced to acknowledge that his grandfather's war stories, while genuine and heroic, had been products of a different era with different social norms. He had to recognize that his own military experiences, while valuable and meaningful, had taken place in a context where women's exclusion from combat roles was based on policy rather than capability. Most difficult of all, Marcus had been compelled to examine specific incidents throughout his career where he had witnessed, participated in, or failed to challenge behavior that marginalized women in military settings. Conversations he had dismissed as harmless banter were revealed as expressions of bias that created hostile environments. Assumptions he had made about women's capabilities were exposed as prejudices unsupported by evidence. The investigation had also revealed that Marcus's case was not isolated. Interviews with personnel across multiple service branches had uncovered patterns of resistance to women in combat roles that range from subtle bias to overt hostility. The incident at Camp Pendleton had become a catalyst for broader discussions about the challenges of cultural change in military organizations. Sarah Chun, for her part, had handled the aftermath of the incident with the same professionalism that had marked her response to the assault itself. She had provided testimony when required, participated in policy discussions about preventing similar incidents, and continued her duties with naval special warfare without missing a beat. In one of the more remarkable aspects of the entire case, Sarah had actually advocated for leniency in Marcus's sentencing. Her written statement to the panel was a model of grace under pressure and strategic thinking about the larger implications of the case. While Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's actions were clearly inappropriate and dangerous, Sarah had written, I believe that his case represents an opportunity for education and growth rather than simply punishment. The military is undergoing significant cultural changes, and we will encounter resistance from individuals who struggle to adapt to new realities. How we handle these situations will determine whether we can successfully integrate all qualified personnel regardless of gender. Sarah's recommendation had significant weight with the panel, not just because she was the victim of the assault, but because her own exemplary service record gave her credibility on questions of military effectiveness and unit cohesion. The fact that she was advocating for constructive consequences rather than maximum punishment demonstrated the kind of leadership thinking that had earned her position in naval special warfare. The panel's decision reflected both the seriousness of Marcus's actions and the complexity of the broader issues involved. Marcus was found guilty on all charges but received a sentence that emphasized rehabilitation and education rather than purely punitive measures. He was reduced in rank from staff sergeant to corporal, forfeited 6 months of pay, and was required to complete extensive training on gender integration, bias awareness, and professional conduct. More significantly, he was assigned to a new unit under the command of officers specifically chosen for their experience in managing cultural transitions and their commitment to inclusive leadership. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus was required to participate in a new military program designed to address bias and prejudice before they escalated to dangerous levels. The program, which had been developed partially in response to his case, involved intensive counseling, education about unconscious bias, and practical training in working effectively with diverse military personnel. The assignment that would define the next phase of Marcus's career was both ironic and purposeful. He was transferred to a joint task force that included personnel from all service branches and was specifically tasked with developing training protocols for gender-integrated units. His supervisor would be Colonel Patricia Morrison, the officer who had responded to the incident at Camp Pendleton and who had extensive experience in managing the challenges of military cultural change. Rodriguez, Colonel Morrison told him during their first meeting, "You have two choices here. You can spend the rest of your career being bitter about how the military is changing, or you can become part of the solution to making those changes work effectively. Your knowledge of the resistance that some personnel feel toward gender integration could actually be valuable if you're willing to use it constructively." The work was challenging in ways that Marcus had never anticipated. He was required to examine his own biases in detail, to understand how those biases affected his interactions with others, and to develop strategies for recognizing and addressing similar attitudes in other personnel. The process was often uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but it was also educational in ways that challenged his assumptions about learning and growth. One of the most difficult aspects of Marcus's rehabilitation was a series of meetings with women who were serving in combat roles across different service branches. These conversations were designed to help him understand the experiences, challenges, and perspectives of the people he had so confidently dismissed as unqualified for military service. The conversations revealed a complexity that Marcus had never considered. These women had overcome not just the physical and mental challenges of military training, but also the additional burden of proving themselves in environments where their presence was questioned and their capabilities were constantly scrutinized. Their stories of determination, sacrifice, and professional excellence forced Marcus to confront the reality that his prejudices had blinded him to the actual experiences and capabilities of his fellow service members. Perhaps the most impactful of these conversations was with Captain Maria Santos, an Army Ranger who had completed multiple combat deployments and had earned decorations for valor in action. Captain Santos had joined the Rangers shortly after combat roles were open to women, and her experiences provided Marcus with insights into both the challenges and the opportunities created by gender integration. "The thing you need to understand," Captain Santos told Marcus during one of their sessions, "is that we're not asking for special treatment or lower standards. We're asking for the opportunity to serve our country at the highest level our abilities allow." When you question Commander Chin's qualifications, you weren't protecting military standards. You were denying the evidence of her actual performance based on assumptions that had nothing to do with her capabilities. The conversation had struck Marcus with the force of revelation. Captain Santos was describing exactly the kind of warrior that he had always aspired to be: courageous, competent, and completely dedicated to mission success. The fact that she happened to be a woman had no bearing on her effectiveness as a soldier, and his failure to recognize that effectiveness had been a failure of his own judgment rather than evidence of her limitations. As Marcus progressed through the rehabilitation program, he began to understand that his personal transformation was part of a much larger process affecting the entire military. The integration of women into combat roles was not just a policy change, but a fundamental shift in military culture that required new approaches to leadership, teamwork, and professional development. The joint task force he was assigned to was developing training materials and protocols that would help other personnel navigate the same cultural transitions that he was experiencing. His unique perspective as someone who had initially resisted these changes but was now working to understand and support them made him valuable in developing programs that could reach other resistant personnel. 1 year after the incident at Camp Pendleton, Marcus found himself participating in a training exercise that was remarkably similar to the one where his confrontation with Sarah Chun had occurred. This time, however, he was serving as a subject matter expert on bias awareness and inclusive leadership, helping to educate other personnel about the importance of professional behavior in integrated units. The exercise included personnel from multiple service branches, including several women serving in combat roles. Marcus watched these women perform with the same professional competence that Sarah had demonstrated, and he found himself genuinely impressed by their skills and leadership capabilities rather than threatened by them. During the after-action review, Marcus was asked to speak about the lessons learned from his own experience and the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of unit composition. Standing before an audience that included many of the same types of elite operators who had witnessed his breakdown a year earlier, Marcus delivered remarks that reflected the depth of his personal transformation. "A year ago, I made the mistake of allowing personal bias to interfere with my professional judgment and military discipline," Marcus told the assembled personnel. "I allowed assumptions about gender roles to prevent me from recognizing the actual capabilities and qualifications of a fellow service member. That failure of judgment led me to behave in ways that violated everything I claimed to believe about military values and professional conduct." Marcus paused, looking out at an audience that included several women serving in combat roles, before continuing with words that would have been impossible for him to speak a year earlier. "The military is stronger when we evaluate people based on their actual performance, rather than our assumptions about their potential. The integration of qualified women into combat roles doesn't lower our standards. It expands our talent pool and makes us more effective as a fighting force. Our job as professional military personnel is to ensure that every qualified person has the opportunity to serve at the highest level of their capabilities." The presentation was well received, but more importantly for Marcus, it represented a genuine expression of beliefs that he had come to embrace through his own hard-won experience and education. The transformation from someone who had violently rejected gender integration to someone who could articulate its benefits was complete and authentic. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah Chun remained professional and distant. They had encountered each other several times during the course of the investigation and his rehabilitation, and their interactions had been cordial but formal. Sarah had made it clear that she held no personal animosity toward Marcus, but she had also maintained appropriate boundaries given their history and their different positions in the military hierarchy. In one of their final interactions, which occurred during a conference on military cultural change, Sarah approached Marcus after his presentation on bias awareness training. "Corporal Rodriguez," she said, using his current rank with the same professional respect she would show any other service member. "I wanted to tell you that I think your work on this issue is valuable and important. It takes courage to acknowledge mistakes and work to correct them." Marcus looked at the woman he had once viewed as a threat to everything he believed in and saw instead a professional colleague whose respect he had finally earned through genuine change and growth. "Thank you, ma'am," Marcus replied. "I owe you an apology that I should have offered long ago. My behavior was inexcusable, and your professionalism in handling the situation was exactly what I should have expected from someone with your qualifications and experience." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his apology, but kept the conversation brief and professional. For both of them, the incident had become a learning experience that extended far beyond their personal interaction to encompass broader questions about military culture, professional standards, and the ongoing evolution of American armed forces. As Marcus continued his military career in his new role, he carried with him hard-won wisdom about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of evaluating people based on their actual capabilities rather than assumptions about their potential. The incident that had nearly ended his career had instead become the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and professionalism. The story of Marcus Rodriguez and Sarah Chun became a case study used in military leadership courses, a cautionary tale about the consequences of bias, and an example of how individuals and organizations could grow and improve even after serious failures. Most importantly, it became part of the larger story of the American military's ongoing evolution toward a more inclusive and effective force that could draw on the talents and capabilities of all qualified personnel regardless of gender. For both Marcus and Sarah, the incident at Camp Pendleton became a defining moment that shaped the rest of their careers and their understanding of what it meant to serve their country with honor and distinction.